Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leis.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Leis, and it's Thursday, May the 30th, and delighted to see everyone here joining us live on a number of social media platforms, including YouTube and X. And we're delighted that you could join us. We look forward to your questions, your comments about a very important topic today that matters to Canadians in so many different ways. And we have a very special guest, the Honorable Preston Manning, who will be joining us for a conversation in a moment, really on the topic, is the state too big? And how do we get a hold of this? How do we bring the levers of democracy, of the people's voice to bear when it comes to managing the state's affairs? And does, in fact, this issue matter to Canadians? Well, I'm sure you'll agree that it does. And again, we're eager to hear your comments, and please share these links with friends and family, because if you think you pay enough taxes, and if you think there's too much unaccountable government, that's certainly one very important angle to it. But there's many others that relate to really not just the quality of our lives, but ultimately our prosperity and how we can live our lives as we see fit. So on that note, I am very delighted to introduce our guest, the Honorable Preston Manning, who is certainly well known across our nation. He served as a member of the Canadian Parliament from 1993 to 2001. He was also the leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2000. He's founded two political parties, and he's made a big impact from coast to coast. So a warm welcome to you, Preston. We're so glad you could join us.
Well, thank you, David. I'm glad to do so.
Well, Preston, your pen and mind are at it again as you reflect on so many relevant topics to Canadians. And most recently, you wrote, I thought, a very insightful column in the Epoch Times, a great newspaper. And the title was Why the Federal Bureaucracy Must Be Reined In by a Newly Elected Government. Well, we certainly know that the polls certainly point to, at the federal level at least, a change in government. And so with that in mind, we've seen a large change within the size, the scale of the federal government. It's actually almost stunning. I think that if you look at the last 10 years alone, we've doubled the size of the federal service. And you could certainly argue around that. But why does this topic matter? Why did you write this column, Preston Manning?
Well, I anticipate a change in the federal government. And one of the big challenges of any new government, not just in Ottawa, is how to get control of a very large public service. In the federal case, you've got now over 370,000 federal civil servants all over the country. If you get a majority government in the Parliament, say 180 seats out of 338, you got a majority government. You got 35 cabinet ministers at the top of that, and a prime minister on the top of that. And this little group has to control and get control of this huge machine. And that is a major challenge. And it's one that needs to be thought through before you get a new government. If you only start thinking about it the day after you form a majority government, it's a little bit too late. So I was trying to raise that issue in that respect.
I think you're right on. So you're really challenging all of us as Canadians, but in particular, any new government or any government period, to really think about how the people, through the democratically elected process, have a voice and power over the civil service. We know that we've got to have a good civil service, but, when does it become out of our control? And I thought
that's a good point, David, that this starts not with what you actually do with the bureaucracy, but it starts with who do you have elected to that legislature or parliament? Because if you have people in the parliament or the legislature who think that the answer to every conceivable problem and issue is some action by the government or some expenditure of taxpayers' money, it'll be the legislatures and the parliaments that are driving, at least one of the major factors in driving the growth of the civil service. So
Hmm.
you need people, I think, elected that have a concept of what we used to call limited government, that governments can do a few things well, but if you
Hmm.
try to get them to do everything, you'll contribute to the civil service. One story that your readers might find interesting, my father spent 33 years in the Alberta legislature, 25 years as premier. And when he
Amazing.
retired in 1968, we visited the cabinet room for one of the last times. It was one of the last times that he was going to be there. And he said, you know, before I leave here, what I should do is carve into the ceiling of this place or print it on the walls a question. Is there somebody else out there who could do better what we are talking about in here?
Isn't that brilliant?
In
So
other
can you
words,
repeat that question again,
well,
Preston?
yeah,
The
is there
question would be,
anybody else out there, meaning outside the
mhm,
government, that could do better what we are talking about at this cabinet table?
precisely.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
other words, that if the elected people have this view that government is the answer to everything, then you'll have this continued bloating of the public service, no matter what else you do.
I think that's spot on. So this is a very profound question because it just doesn't relate to the size of government in terms of its overhead and costs and, undermining prosperity ultimately, but it relates to the ability of citizens to have air to breathe and the freedom to be innovative and create solutions to a lot of the challenges we face. And that's called civil society. I mean, that's the history of our country, isn't it, Preston? That we've had group after group, whether it's places of faith to service clubs to all kinds of creative charities that have come to the fore to deal with Canada's challenges.
Well, no, that's true, and well, one of the biggest concerns of this is just the cost of it because it translates into ever increasing taxation. But
Hmm.
there's these broader considerations of the interference of a huge public bureaucracy with basic freedoms and the squeezing out the non-governmental sector as the governmental sector gets larger.
Hmm.
If you develop a plan and I think anybody thinking of forming a new government has to have a plan as to how they're going to relate to the public service. And what some of your viewers might think about, what are the elements of that plan? I think one of them is this identifying who you've got in the public service. You do have professionals, you do have genuine professionals
Hmm.
that will, if there's a change of government, they'll do their best to try to help that government implement their plans. You also have potential allies. Like as the disillusionment with the Liberal government in Ottawa occurs, you've got that disillusionment inside the public service. You've got people in the finance department who are as concerned about this out of control spending as the taxpayers are. You have
Hmm.
people in the Justice Department that are tired of defending these unethical practices by cabinet ministers, even by the Prime Minister. You've got people in the Foreign Affairs Department that think that the current Foreign Affairs Minister is a disaster and needs to be replaced. So you've got
Hmm.
allies. So you've
Hmm.
got professionals that you want to know who they are. You've got allies, but there's also a bunch of people in there that you need to promote to the private sector if there's a change of government. There's political patronage appointments, there's political hacks, there's redundant people, and there needs to be a plan to, graciously but firmly transition them out of the
Hmm.
public service. And you got to have that plan before you ever get there. If you start thinking about that the day after you're elected, it's already too late.
Indeed. So I think within that column, you actually kind of reference a basic kind of but profound 3-point plan. And you've just mentioned that is that one of the first tasks is, while keeping in mind that it's very important to have a capable professional civil service, is to identify the professionals. And I guess one of the things that, for those people that maybe aren't as familiar with the structures or machinery of government, is that virtually everything that's undertaken in government is really executed through kind of a trust and lines of authority with the civil service. And so a lot of them are very, and it's hard to generalize, but are very capable and hardworking, but others that are clearly not. Some are actually appointed to be kind of almost, use the word political hacks in the article. But it reminds me of a great kind of a comedy, and I think we referenced this before in our conversation, called Yes Minister. It's a British comedy series, and people, if you have not seen it, you've got to watch it. But basically is a parody of British cabinet ministers navigating the reality that their deputy ministers or their top of the civil service appointments are really firmly in control and running circles around them. Do you think that happens a lot within the civil service, Preston, from
Well, I do
your
think
experience and
it's a big
impressions?
problem, and particularly if the less skilled your cabinet ministers are, the more dependent they are upon those people, and that's why again it is very important to who you select to be your members of parliament and that, because ultimately this is where the cabinet ministers are going to come from, and the more skilled and knowledgeable they are, the better able they're able to deal with the public service, but also to get outside expertise. Yeah, that program is just a perfect
Well,
illustration.
it is quite funny. I understand that Margaret Thatcher actually strongly encouraged, if not required, every of her elected officials to watch several episodes of that program. So again, have you seen Yes Minister? To our audience, I'd love to hear from you in terms of your comments. I'm talking with the Honorable Preston Manning about reining in the size of the state for the newly elected government. So that was point number one, identify the professionals. And that's not an easy task because that could take potentially years. If not, well, how would you go about that? Or do you bring in new civil servants who you absolutely know they're the right
Well,
people
there's
and
there's a
bring the
number
right
of there's
attitude?
consultants that have been dealing, for example, with the government for years who have an idea as to who the professionals are and who aren't. And they are one source. There's also just recently retired civil servants, some of whom have a perspective on this and are not happy with what's happening with the civil service. So there are different sources that, but there are other things you can do to add to this plan, David. If your idea is to somehow reduce the size of the federal civil service, one area is to take a look with the federal government as to where it is intruding on provincial jurisdiction. And there's about 6 areas where it's doing that. It's doing that in the health area. The Constitution assigns health care to the provinces, but the federal government has an act whereby it intrudes in the health field. The Constitution assigns natural resources to the provinces, but the federal government just had a bill introduced intruding into that sector. The Constitution assigns municipal government to the provincial government, but the federal government's been running the provinces through the National Housing Act and the Canada Infrastructure Bank to deal directly with the cities without dealing with the provinces. Now, these are all these intrusions into provincial jurisdiction are authorized by some federal statute. If the new government passed an act to respect provincial jurisdiction and reduce that reduction by amending those acts, it would reduce. There's a whole bunch of civil servants that have to implement these intrusions. This would be one major way of reducing the role of the federal government where it ought not to be, and reducing the size of the public service in the course of doing that.
So, in many ways, you're saying, Preston, if I'm hearing you correctly, is any government, including the federal government, needs to focus on things that it can do well and to stay in its constitutional lane. And that needs to be enacted right away, so that you basically enable that focus, and that will ultimately determine part of the scale and scope of the
Yes,
federal
yes. No,
government.
no one disagrees that the federal government should be responsible for foreign affairs. No one disagrees that they should have
Yes.
ultimate responsibility for fiscal and monetary policy. Nobody disagrees that they have responsibility with respect to indigenous peoples. So why doesn't the federal government focus on the area doing
Exactly.
better in the
Yeah.
areas where nobody questions their jurisdiction?
So on that point though, Preston, help us understand, because I think for a lot of us as Canadians, we're a little bit confused because we hear about, well, let's just say this, the federal government trying to provide, say, breakfast, lunch programs for school children. Like, not many people wouldn't be against that, although you could say, well, let's enable parents to be stronger to be able to provide meals for their kids. But when it comes to that, we already have levels of government that have responsibility for that. That's namely the province with their local government counterparts and schools. They're responsible for that. It's not the federal government. So why, in your mind, is, to ask a silly question, why is the federal government continually, that's the pattern of putting its nose into the business of the provinces? Why are they doing that?
Well, I think it's politically motivated. If there's an issue that the public's concerned about, of course, the federal guys want to say, well, we're doing something about it. Yeah. And so if there's concerns about the school children getting properly fed, the inclination, the pollster comes and says, a lot of people are concerned about so the inclination of the federal government to say, well, we ought to do something in that area. And I think one of the things that need to be clarified by whoever forms the next government is stick to your jurisdictional areas. And a lot of this national unity, that there's a lot of unrest among the provincial governments with respect to the federal government. This is not good for the federation, but a lot of that is caused by this intrusion of the federal government into areas of provincial jurisdiction.
No, I think that's right. And imagine all the wasted time and energy of gnashing of teeth as they argue as the federal government should just really stick to its knitting. I think that's a very good point. So the first point is identify those professionals. And the second one you alluded to earlier was identify potential allies. What do you mean by allies?
Well, as I mentioned, there are people in the federal civil service who disagree with the current direction of the federal government and who want to see changes themselves. They have to be discreet. They can't go out and say that. But as I mentioned, there's people in the finance department who are worried sick about the debt load and the uncontrolled spending. They're as worried as the taxpayers are. So these are potential allies if there's a change in government, but you got to know who they are.
Indeed. Do you think that this issue is being identified more and more by Canadians across our country, Preston, that the state is just simply getting too big, it's getting too complex, and no one really has a strong handle on managing the country?
Well, where it affects the ordinary citizens is at the tax level, that the cost of all this. It's you, the taxpayer, paying for all of this. And then the second area is when the citizen goes to the federal government to get services or something, and you got to go through 8 layers of bureaucracy to get anywhere. Just call one of those federal government help numbers. You get 14 options and you're told to wait for 2 days. Like I think the impossibility of bureaucracies to deliver services effectively, citizens are conscious of that if they go looking for services. So I think there's 2 or 3 places where the average citizen becomes conscious that too big a government is a big problem, and it's a big problem for you as a citizen. And this isn't just a political partisan issue.
I think you're right. And speaking of it not being a partisan issue, I did want to share this clip from Stephen Ledrew. He's certainly a very prominent liberal leader. So could we share that clip?
Wonder about the ability of our federal government to get anything straight. The Prime Minister put out a statement recently congratulating Israel on its anniversary of independence. He said Canada was amongst the very first countries to recognize the independence. No. We were way down the line, months and months and months after it was independent. In fact, I think we were after Guatemala. But the Prime Minister can't even get history, but we know he lies all the time. But let's just talk about the ability of government to get things right. People in BC, Lionsgate Bridge. I know it's provincial, but the feds are in there too. It's been a mess for years and years and years. People in Toronto, they are closing down part of the main highway into the city, the Gardiner, for 3 years to repair the road. 3 years. No one complained about that. People in Montreal, you certainly know about bridges there and how long it takes to build bridges. People in Maritimes, We talk about the ferries, breaking down all the time. And here's the doozy, that Trans Mountain Pipeline. Yep, it was starting off around 4.5 billion, we finished it in a few years, is around 35 billion years late. The government just seems unable to do big projects. But then let's just look at the little things. Things like passports, things like healthcare. They just can't seem to get anything right. And yet, when you listen to the politicians, Prime Minister, first of all, and the other politicians, the quislings he has in cabinet, they're all saying, we are having a great government. Canada's number one. Simply not true. And with an independent press like this is not the press, but this is analysis, you get to hear some of the other points of view of what's going on. But it's not just a point of view, it's certain facts. And everybody across our country, and I listen to people all over the place, in the cities, in the country, rural places, and they are saying, Canada is just not working. So you've heard them say, well, it's not broken. Well, it is. Canada is now the laughingstock of the world. Our Prime Minister is disregarded by the leaders of the world, and he's simply making the case that he is the big shot and he wants to be reelected because of the good jobs they're doing. Well, the fact of the matter is, our government was increased, the federal government, by 100,000 bureaucrats, really well paid, big pensions, living across the country, and they are in great shape. And do we have better government? No. So let's just forget about these promises of dental care and pharmacare and health care and daycare and all the other things the Prime Minister said he has accomplished for you with your money. No, it's simply not true, because government can't do those things. Let's unelect politicians who promise the mountains, promise the pipelines, and get somebody in there who can just do what governments are supposed to do, provide basic services.
So there you have it. That's a pretty hard-hitting analysis by Stephen LeDrew, former prominent Liberal leader. So what do you think about that? Is he being too hard-hitting, cynical about government and recognizing really its limitations?
No, I think that's a fair analysis of the problem. Of course, the challenge is to okay, how to fix it. And this is something even that opposition politicians have to watch. It's very easy to criticize what's being done, and there's lots to criticize. But the more important thing is how are we going to fix it? One of another point that should be on that plan list, and he partially referred to it, is to take a look at what can be privatized that the government is already doing. Like this business of the government or a government entity building pipelines. There's all kinds of people in this country that could build pipelines and have built pipelines all over the world. And taking a look at what can be done by the private sector. And then the more that you contract out things to the private sector, then the public service can be reduced to all it has to do is monitor that. It doesn't have to actually provide the service.
No, I think that's a brilliant point. In fact, at Frontier for years, there's been a brilliant senior fellow, Ian Madsen, who's done what are called financial valuations on the host of crown corporations, really government entities across this country. And that analysis proves many things, not the least of which is that usually those crown corporations are not performing in terms of their finances, their bottom line. But I don't know if people realize this. Those crown corporations are in the end controlled politically. They don't necessarily make wise business decisions. But what happens is they hire a lot of people so they can be very inefficient, and they are creating a culture, Preston, as you'd observe, that is really very much like government. And so that would be a relatively easy thing to do, is to privatize so many of those corporations, like a number of past governments did years ago, and I believe they privatized Air Canada, Canadian National, and those companies now are, you may not always agree, but are very high-performing companies that pay taxes now. And I think that's part of Canada's productivity challenge, is it not? Is that we have a very large government, and that includes a lot of crown corporations that really need to be privatized.
Yeah, well, if you have this plan that includes identifying the professionals, identifying your allies, identifying who has to go, if you've got a plan that includes this reducing the federal intrusion in areas of provincial responsibility, so this reduces the role of the federal government and the size of the public service. If you look at just an objective look at what can be privatized, who can do the job most cost effectively. In some cases, it may be the government. In some cases, it may be the private sector. But if it's the private sector, then contract out. You've got this list. Now, one of the people that I really respect on this subject is Professor Donald Savoy of Moncton.
Yes, indeed.
He's the chair of this what do they call it? The chair of public governance that's looked at this question for years. And Donald's got a number of suggestions as to what could be done to improve the situation. One of them I don't quite agree with, or maybe it's a long-term thing. He suggests you need a royal commission, that this serious problem is serious enough that requires a royal commission. My worry about royal commissions is that the last two that were done on this subject, the Glasgow Commission and the Lambert Commission, it took 3 years to report and cost millions of dollars. And there may be some long-term merit in that, but this next government of Canada is going to need answers to some of these questions within 3 or 4 months. So whether appointing more a short-term task force to get at developing this plan, maybe there's a longer range approach that can be taken. But I think we need answers to this, at least some partial answers to these questions within 3 or 4 months of the election of a new government.
I would be inclined to agree with you. But you see this issue through a sense of urgency. I think of the discussion that we've heard, certainly the last few years in Canada, has been a pronounced decline in productivity in our country, and certainly a decline in our standard of living. I think that the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Rogers, used the metaphor that it's time to break the glass when it comes to Canada's challenges of declining productivity. And this has a real impact on Canadians' lives. So we don't have, in my sense, I'd agree with you, a lot of time to figure this out. We've got to go in with a plan and hit the ground running. I think that's your point, is it not, Preston?
Oh, yes. And there are people that are working on this. One of the proposals that the Conservative Party of Canada has as the official opposition is just on the spending side, that for every new dollar of spending, it has to come from saving a dollar somewhere else. It shouldn't be additional spending. I mean, that's a rule that, if it was actually applied, would achieve some constraint on increased spending and increased size of the public service. But the official opposition really are the ones that need this plan for what to do if after the next election you're running the ship.
Exactly. Very much so.
I've used this analogy that winning an election these days is like winning the right to ride the bull at the Calgary Stampede. The bull is
that's a powerful metaphor.
May be interested in throwing you off.
Exactly. Yeah. So how do you ride the bull? How do we get a rein on the real power, really, in Ottawa, as well as so many other provincial capitals and other local governments? Is really the seminal question is how do we have a rein on that kind of unelected power? And I think you have a very powerful quote actually in your column. You say, "But with the growth of the civil service and the size of the public bureaucracies today, increasingly the chief opposition to the decisions and policies of a newly elected government may not be that of the official opposition, but that of unelected public officials, the opposition of officials." Have you seen that over the years, Preston? Are there examples that you had in mind when you wrote that?
Oh, yes. In Ottawa, suppose you have a policy paper. Suppose a think tank like the Frontier Centre has a policy paper, and the minister agrees with it 100%. This is a great idea. He hands it to the deputy minister. The deputy minister hands it to his legal people, particularly if it involves a change in the statute. He hands it to the called the Legal Services Branch of the Justice Department. And these people take a look at it and they write a memo to the minister. Here's 25 things that these idiots outside don't understand about that statute. Now, half the stuff that they send to the minister is very useful information because they know why clause 65 of that act was amended 3 years ago because of a court decision. Half of their advice is good, but they are defenders of the status quo because they had so much to do with the status quo. And so this is a resistance from inside. The minister thinks this is a great idea, but he gets this memo. Here's 35 things that are wrong with it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example. So you really have to have enormous commitment and wisdom and courage and experience to be able to take on that kind of formidable team in the civil service.
Well,
Otherwise,
and
they'll run
a
circles
balanced
around you.
source of advice, David. Like you need the advice from these experienced people inside. There's no point in saying that you don't, but you also need advice from outside, and so that the minister can balance the internal advice with the external advice. One of the criticisms of the current government is this is a different criticism we haven't touched on is that the civil servants are actually providing less and less advice to the cabinet, and the Privy Council office has this host of outside consultants who not everybody knows who they are, and they're not accountable when the policy advice goes sideways. That one of the additional issues is how do you get this balance between we've gone all the way from civil servants providing 90% of the advice to 80% of the advice coming from outside consultants attached to the Privy Council office. How do you get the proper balance? So that's another item for your list of the plan.
Okay, a very good discussion here. And one of the things I have a question here from the audience is a lot of this this mess created because it's all about short-term political thinking rather than policy. Is that a question that makes sense?
Well, yes. There's like a new prime minister, and premiers do this too. They write these mandate letters to the new ministers. Okay, you're going to be the minister of such and such. Here's a mandate letter. And some of these mandate letters are 3 pages long. It's everything under the sun. And they're basically politically motivated. They want to make the government look like it's dealing with whatever the laundry list of problems are. And this is an area where you'd be far better to have 6 items on that mandate list that are measurable as to whether you can achieve them or not, than to have 35 items that the minister's not going to begin to be able to deal with them. And but those lists are dictated more by the politics of the day. And part of the problem is with the conventional media. If a government tackles this problem, they're going to be hammered by the traditional media, depending on its biases. Harper reduced civil servants by about 20,000 when he got in. And of course, they were hammered for being indifferent, and you want to cut programs to widows and orphans, and there's editorials and all the rest. Chrétien and Martin were forced to reduce a federal civil servant by 50,000 back in our day. And there wasn't anywhere near the howling. In fact, there was editorials saying, isn't it too bad? I'm sure Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Martin really hated to have to do that, almost sympathy. So how to handle the communications of this getting a hold of the civil servants is a real challenge for a new government.
No, I think you're right. And it's interesting that I'm talking to you, Preston Manning, and it relates to the whole issue of when it comes to communications. And that has to do with how do you build the case? And I mean this with integrity because you're at the forefront of this years ago, saying that the deficit does matter, the debt matters. And I think you kind of really played an instrumental role in building the case that with the political will then of others to actually make some really tough decisions around the scale and scope of government. I think of some of Paul Martin's decisions and with Jean Chrétien. And there were certainly others that Mulroney tried to work at as well. But Canada was on a really bad track of bigger and bigger deficits, as you know so well. Can you give us advice on how a new government really looks at the eyes of Canadians and says, we've got a real problem and we've got to get our fiscal house in order, and we've got some tough
what helps is
decisions
to
make?
build up public support for this. Like, but back in the early 1980s, the pollsters, when the Reform Party was being put together, the pollsters came to us and said that there is less than 25% support from the public for this business of balancing the budget. So instead of saying, well, I guess we shouldn't campaign on that because there's not a lot of public support. No. We said, okay, we're going to change that. We're going to go out and crusade. This is a big problem, and it's costing you something as a taxpayer. And it took, of course, we used more public meetings and literature and door-to-door campaigning and that. But by the 93 election, that number of people that were saying that this is a problem was up to over 50%. This is why Chrétien and Martin attacked the problem. It wasn't because they suddenly had an ideological conversion to balance the budget. It's because their pollsters came in and told them, look, these idiots out there have cranked up the public support for this to the point where it can't be ignored by whoever's the government.
Right.
And so efforts by think tanks and by third parties to acquaint the public with the seriousness of this problem and to get the public support up, that makes it a lot easier for a government to do something about it.
So to be clear, you help set the table, if you will, in terms of generating the public support, the will to make those decisions. And so today, what strikes me as quite a challenge is we don't kind of have the same mainstream media that we did before. I know there's debates about to what extent they were balanced before, but today we've got some 2,000 media outlets that ironically are on the government dole in terms of federal support. They actually sign documents to the effect that they'll be looking seriously at how they cover news coverage through a certain lens. Does that not create a special challenge then for any new government to get its message out and say, these are the facts, this is urgent matters to be able to make decisions around our financial shape of our country?
I think it does, but I think that it's the effort to get the public to be saying to the government this is a problem than the government having to say to them this is a problem.
Okay.
It's a lot easier for a government to act when the public is saying to them, look, we think this is a problem, get on with it, than when the government perceives a problem but has to go out and convince the public that this is so.
So is your sense that across Canada, a la some of comments made by Stephen Ledrew, is that are you hearing as well more and more concerns from Canadians that we really do need to get the size of government and our financial house in order?
Well, I think the broader thing, and the polls reflect this, although you have to be careful about polls. Diefenbaker said only dogs know what to do with polls. So
yes, okay.
shouldn't take that into account. But I think the polls are showing there's general dissatisfaction with the government's management of a whole bunch of issues, including the fiscal and financial side. And this is leading to the distinct possibility of change of government when there's an election. And the bigger challenge is for that whoever is next in line to form the government, which is the Conservative Party of Canada under Pierre Poilievre, being prepared to deal with these problems, including the one that we've discussed today. I think that's the bigger challenge now, being prepared to deal with that problem.
Okay. I do have a question from our audience, and it has to do with the hiring of civil servants. Is it possible to actually deal with the civil service if they've been hired under new rules that contradict merit? And I think the EG is, like, for example, diversity, equity, inclusion. So in other words, if I understand the question correctly, do you have a different type of civil servants that really doesn't focus on merit anymore, but on other
Well,
ideological
I think that's the thing
tests.
that has to be reversed, that the emphasis has to be put on merit first. And that'll require some reversal of the criteria for hiring. And even to like this current criteria where what is looked at is gender, what's looked at is race, what's looked at is sexual orientation. Even that kind of hiring is ultimately unfair to those people. Because suppose a woman gets hired on that basis, and people say, "Oh no, the only reason you're a judge or the only reason you're a deputy is because you're a female or you're the right race." Maybe she is very competent, but it's even unfair to the people that are ultimately hired under those criteria. So uh, I hate to say it going backwards, but going to merit hiring has to be part of the future of the hiring in the civil service.
Yeah, it really does make sense. Now, there are, when we talk about the size of the state, what occurs to me as well is how do we deal with this issue well, Preston, if we don't confront squarely the whole issue of transparency? And it's very interesting because I believe there was just an alert today about the Prime Minister really objecting to sharing quote, secretive cabinet documents about foreign interference with, ironically, the inquiry on foreign interference. I mean, how are we supposed to get at the bottom of things if we don't share documents? But there was an interesting story that was reported this week. I believe it was just today, where Treasury Board in Ottawa was proposing to change the sunset rules around when documents no longer become secretive. So in other words, right now, today in Canada, if I understand the rules correctly, quote, secret documents are held in limbo forever. There's no sunset where they become public after, say, 10 or 20 years. But instead, they're held in these, I imagine, giant warehouses or even electronic ones, that these documents are held indefinitely. And the irony is that historians have trouble researching Canada, and they have to go to other countries' archives to find out what may have happened historically because we are so secretive as a government culture. Now, does that not undermine the whole opportunity to find out and hold government to account?
Well, that's another item that can be put on this list. I'm a great believer in sunset clauses, not just on information, but sunset clauses anyway. For programs and everything else, even if you decide to renew the program, the fact that the sunset clause forces you to say, do we really need this or not? And this applies to, again, applies to secrecy regulations as well. There should be the sunset clauses there. The sunset clauses should be more shorter rather than longer. And I'd say I'm in favor of a sunset clause on the current government. So I would extend it to that broad extent.
No, I agree. So, what do you think to our audience? We're obviously having a far reaching conversation with our friend, the Honorable Preston Manning, about the scale, the size of government. Do you see it as a concern? Is government too large and too complex? Does it concern you? How does this impact you? So, Preston, one of the questions I also have has to do with culture. And that is, like you had served in Ottawa, you know the systems. But it has to do with the fact that to what extent have we generated or created, and not to be unfair with elected officials, a kind of an elected class of officials that are really in a bubble where they have become merged with the senior civil service in some way. They think alike, they act alike in the sense that they think that every solution, as you referenced earlier, is in fact more government, and that they know what's best and what's right for everyone else. They are the, quote, good and the great, and they really don't experience life the way we do, in the sense that, well, let's just take healthcare as an example. We know that I understand that various elected officials don't really have to use our healthcare system. They don't have to wait in long lineups or queues. So if you have to get a hip replacement, they don't have to wait for 2 or 3 years. And that goes for judges as well. And so these people don't experience the kind of feedback pain loop that the rest of us do, as we have to sit in long waiting lists for healthcare. Am I being too cynical about this? Are we in danger that this big state has created, in effect, a different bubble for elected elites in our country? And is that a problem?
Well, I think partly what you're touching on, David, and I've been on this theme for 10 years, this conceptualization, and it's still very prevalent among the traditional media, is that you can look at politics from left, right, or center, and they'll accuse somebody of being too far right or too far left or too centrist. I think that's an obsolete way of looking at it. I think our political culture today is a vertical one, with you have an elite and aristocratic class that actually believes you should constrain the role of ordinary people in governance, and that they don't understand the issues. They just need to be told what the answer is. And that the new dynamic is an aristocratic elite group versus a populist bottom-up group that disagree with that's the framework for looking at the Trump phenomena in the United States. It's not a left, right, center thing. It's a vertical thing. Aristocratic elite class versus rank and file people looking for somebody to lead them out of the wilderness. And that elite class has these privileges that you're talking about. And the only people that can change that are the voters. The one thing you can say to the voters, there are more of you than there is in that other group. And so if you exercise your franchise in a way that you pick people that are on your side, not part of that aristocratic elite class, you'll get a change. If you don't make those decisions, you won't.
Okay, so that's a very interesting take then on power and politics in Canada today. It's not so much about left or right. It's really about to what extent are we making decisions, including the size of the state, that empower individuals to live their lives, to have control over their lives, instead of genuflecting and bowing in deference to kind of an elite that think they know what is better for the rest of us. Is that it?
Yeah. And it's not a new thing, David. The classic book on this is by de Tocqueville, the French writer who wrote Democracy in America in 1830 something, where he said the real divisions in the United States are not the ones that we're talking about. He said the real divisions are between those who are animated by the aristocratic passion, who wish to reduce the role of ordinary people in governance, and those who are animated by the democratic passion, who wish to expand it. And the guy was, I think the guy was right.
Well, I think that's very well said, Preston. Very powerful discussion, because if you understand that point, then you can see on all kinds of measures the ways that we can, through good public policy and insight, empower people, not disempower them. I think of the whole concept of the rule of law versus the world of rules that are driven by a political class that is not interested in offering equal treatment under the law, but rather implementing their power in the form of rules over other people to control them.
Yeah, well, that's another whole subject, the rule of law. But there's things that ordinary folks can do that if you want the rule of law, you better know what the law is. I chaired this panel for Premier Smith. It was the only government that wanted to look at what are the lessons from the COVID crisis. And in particular, we were to look at should there be changes in the legislation that governs.
We had a very good discussion about it.
Well, and we put the government put a question on their website: what changes, if any, should be made in the laws that governed how we approached COVID? And there were 3,000-4,000 responses to that. What these responses proved is that Albertans didn't have the foggiest notion what the laws were that governed the approach to COVID.
Isn't that interesting?
Not
Yes.
the foggiest notion. So then we and to be fair, then we put up some. Here's the laws that govern this. But what that indicates is if you want the rule of law, citizens have to pay a little bit more attention to what those laws are. And it doesn't mean you got to know the revised statutes of Canada, but you maybe should know what the charter says, what the Constitution says. If it's a public health crisis, maybe you should know what the Emergency Act says or what the Public Act says. Or if they're closing down your schools, maybe it wouldn't hurt to know what the Education Act is. I think we often say we want the rule of law, but then we as citizens don't do a lot to.
I think you're right on. So we've had a far-reaching conversation about this really a very important topic, Preston. And so it begs the question, what can we as citizens do? And I know you've written extensively about this. I think your book was called Do Something. You had many very practical suggestions. What would you be advising citizens to do as they look at this huge morass of a government that just has octopus arms over every aspect of our life? Where do we begin
Just
on this?
one simple thing is, as we're going to get into a federal election campaign and debate, is to have a couple of questions ready for your candidates, or have questions ready for your existing MP. What specifically are you proposing in order to reduce the federal civil service size and to reduce the federal deficit and debt? Have some concrete questions, and then govern your voting response to how well those questions are answered.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I think perhaps another way to look at this is to look at the outcome. What is frankly, the ideal size of government in this country? If you look at the opportunity to have a thriving economy, I think if Goldilocks comes to my mind, we don't want too small a government because there's things that government needs to do. But most importantly, we need a healthy, large, robust private sector. That's the goose that laid the golden egg for Canada. And we're getting to a point where the government is just far too big, and we're putting a tax in the form of deficits and debt on future generations. So there's a moral issue there. So what would be the optimum kind of size of government? I think research consistently points to the idea that the sweet spot is around 26 to, say, 30% tops in terms of the size of government. So we've got to really, I think, don't we as citizens need to push an agenda that says we can't have too big a government, otherwise it doesn't allow us to breathe and do what we need to do to.
Well, I think you're better. Country. I think you're better to approach that at the micro level rather than at 90,000 feet. Like, you can do theoretical papers on it should be 30% or 26%. At the practical level, just answering this question: who can do this job most cost effectively?
Indeed.
And go through everything that a government is doing. Who can do it most cost effectively? And that'll sort out what ought to be in the public sector, what ought to be in the private sector. And I'd be inclined to use a lot of requests for proposals. Ask the question: is there anybody else out there who can do what the government is contemplating and can do it more cost effectively?
I do have a comment. And I do have another question from our audience. All senior bureaucrats and elected officials should have their and their partners' investments put in a blind trust. Without even small first steps, the corruption will never end. What do you think about blind trusts, Preston?
I think there's certainly merit for that for cabinet ministers, and that what you have to be careful on, if you're too restrictive on that, you won't get a lot of good people to touch the running for office or joining the federal civil service. But there's a place for that as long as it's a balanced approach. This is one of the huge problems today. I've been involved in candidate recruitment for public office ever since 1968, the first time I trying to find a candidate to
Amazing.
run in the Fort McMurray Lac-La-Biche by-election in Alberta in 1968. But today, it used to be one of the biggest reasons for people not wanting to run is that it thought it would hurt their financial position. But today, the biggest single reason is given for not wanting to run for public office is that people will not submit themselves to the abuse that they will get from being a public figure, and particularly the abuse that they'll get through the social media. And they'll say, even if I'm willing to put up with that, I'm not willing to subject my family to that. And this is becoming a huge problem in recruiting quality, dedicated people to run for public office.
Indeed. Yeah, we need good elected officials as we need good civil servants. So that is a very important point. We need good people, period. The other question I had was the carbon tax just simply a tax grab when there's no evidence that it will do anything for the environment?
Well, it's hard to answer that question. I think there's some people that advocate the carbon tax out of genuine reasons for concern with what kind of carbon dioxide emissions you're putting into the atmosphere through the combustion of hydrocarbons. There's some people that certainly believe in the legitimacy of that, but I think once the politicians get a hold of it, it can become a pretext for a tax grab and a way to increase government revenues.
Indeed. So when we look forward to other solutions for this challenge of a large state, I'm wondering if one of the challenges that we face as well is the whole public policy function within government, in the sense that a lot of public policy is really not about public policy. It's actually head fakes to short-term political game. And I'm going to share with you a bit of a story I heard from a gentleman named Bill Morneau, the former Liberal finance minister. And he reflected on the whole story of the CERB benefit provided to people, to Canadians during COVID-19. And his team at the Ministry of Finance was given the responsibility to work out a number recommended that was both affordable and effective given all the other programs that would be appropriate. And the number, I believe, was a few $100s per month. And what was fascinating is that a week or two later, when the Prime Minister's office made the announcement, it had ballooned to some $2,000 a month. And kind of the rest is history, because it set a precedent of enormous spending across the board, as everyone observed at that figure and used that as a precedent to say, well, me too, if you're going to give that to individuals. And what's amazing is that Morneau shared the story that in conversation with the Prime Minister, he asked, well, why did you increase it so much? And the response was, well, it was really optics. The look of the figure didn't look high enough, so we thought we'd increase it a lot. So is a lot of our government decision-making sadly not based on policy, but on optics? It's just a political game. We are spending money like drunken sailors all because of optics, not because of public policy.
Well, yes, no, I think that is a huge problem. On that particular issue, but part of the problem there was what Morneau is talking about is dealing with it at the micro level. At the macro level, if you're going to shut down the economy for whatever reason, you better do an impact assessment as to what is that going to be in macro terms. I know the Alberta situation. In the Alberta situation, the contraction of the Alberta economy due to lockdown measures was about 8% of the economy. The Alberta economy is a $300 billion economy. You contract it by 8%, you're going to do $24 billion worth of damage to the economy in terms of reduced revenues, reduced wages, lost jobs, bankruptcies, etc. Now, I think if officials knew that big number, You want to do $24 billion worth of damage? How are you going to compensate that with a couple of $1,000s to whoever, or a couple of $100? I think that macro analysis. The other thing with Alberta, the contraction caused a 7% contraction, or 7% increase in the unemployment rate. Alberta has a workforce of about 2 million full-time jobs. A 7% increase in unemployment means you have hurt 140,000 jobs by those measures. If you knew what the macro thing was, wouldn't it make you hesitate? You're not going to be able to repair that with some micro problem handing a couple of $100s to individual families. So I think the consideration is the macro, start with the macro rather than the micro.
Okay, well, that's good advice, as we have had quite a far-reaching conversation today, Preston. Not a surprise, and I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for joining us for this conversation, and for, again, your voice on these important matters about why the federal government and bureaucracy must be reined in by elected, democratically elected officials. So thank you for joining our conversation today,
Well,
Preston.
thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed it as well.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you for our audience members for joining us as well. And be sure to join us next Thursday as the discussion continues, and be sure to share this with our friends. And thank you, and have a great day.